Their training methods were the most scientific. When it came to sports, the Soviet Union was truly the big red machine. Every gold medal was a triumph for the Soviet system.
Sport was there to promote communism.
Communism is now dead. Soviet sports are dying, the stadiums are empty, top athletes have moved to the West. The glory days are over in a country where sports were always more than a game. Perhaps the greatest sports dynasty in history. Its teams triumphed more consistently than the old New York Yankees over a longer period of time than the Boston Celtics. Gymnastics, track, weightlifting, it almost didn't matter what sport. Once the Soviets got involved, they usually dominated. During this program, we'll look back at the Soviet Union's great triumphs. In the wake of all the political turmoil, Soviet domination of sports seems a lifetime ago. In a sense, it was.
Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism, the show where we get to hear from people who live in a socialist country, have lived in a socialist country, or have studied one extensively. This is your host, Tony. And what you just heard is a clip from a 1991 documentary called More Than a Game, Soviet Sports System. In this episode, Samantha Lomb returns as a guest to talk about a recent book she edited entitled Win or Else, Soviet Football in Moscow and Beyond, 1921 to 1985. In Win or Else, the late Soviet historian Larry E. Holmes shows us how Soviet football culture regularly disregarded official, ideological, and political imperatives and skirted the boundaries between socialism and capitalism. Drawing on rich archival materials as well as newspapers and interviews with former players, Win or Else reveals the foundation of Soviet sports culture and the hazards that teams faced both in victory and in loss. This is a fun conversation, even if you're not specifically interested in sports or a particular sport. We covered the early history of the Soviet conception of sports and physical activity to the intriguing connection Soviet soccer had to the NKVD, the state security organization that would later become known as the KGB. As mentioned, Samantha is returning as a guest. A few years ago now, she was on to talk about her book on the 1936 Stalin Constitution. That episode is called Stalin's Constitution, Life of the 1930 Soviet Union, which focuses on Samantha's specific expertise in Soviet history. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute to support as a Patreon subscriber, you will gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. For example, you'll gain access to an additional conversation I had with Samantha where we talk about the state and controversies of the contemporary study of Soviet history, including the impact of the war in Ukraine. You can do this at patreon.com/AES the podcast. Before we get to the main show, I'd just like to take a second here to shout out to my new Patreon subscribers since the last episode. Their names are Yasha Jane, Vic Vinegar, Sabrina Melendez, Riel, David Elgindy Johnson, Jumpy, Sabina Mamadova, Elortrilis, Food Stamp, and British Warlord. I seriously cannot keep doing this project without your support. If you're unable to contribute in this way, no, that's not a problem. You can help out by sharing this episode by following us on Twitter and other social media platforms, working on that currently, at AES the podcast. You can also subscribe to this show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Also, feel free to leave a review, even if it's just a star rating, as those boost the algorithm in my favor. So I recommend checking out the back catalog as well when you have the chance. As always, what you can really do to help the show by engage in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. Enjoy the episode. I'm very glad and excited to welcome Samantha Lomb back to the show. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you for having me, Tony.
As a little bit of trivia for longtime listeners of the show, Samantha Lomb was actually the first person that I ever interviewed for this show. When you start a podcast and you're looking for guests, you send out a million emails and a million emails don't even get responded. But luckily, Samantha responded to mine and we had a great discussion talking about her book on Stalin's Constitution, which I recommend you all check out. I'll link to our past discussion and her book in the show notes, of course. But today we're going to be talking about something we haven't yet talked about on the show. We've talked about developments in socialist countries pertaining to healthcare, to democracy, to a variety of social programs. But we're going to be talking about sports today and how the Soviet Union dealt with the controversial, so to speak, role of sports in society. And we're going to be doing this through the lens of a book written by the late Larry E. Holmes. The title of the book is Win or Else, Soviet Football in Moscow and Beyond, 1921 to 1985. And Samantha, I believe, acted as an editor for the book, but she'll explain more about that to us. Let's get into it. What inspired Larry Holmes to write this book, and how did you come upon it as its editor?
Larry loved sports, like really, really loved sports. He played baseball in college. He was a runner for decades. He organized a running club when he worked at the University of South Alabama. And when he would come to Kirov, he was very interested in local sports. He would always go to the local hockey matches. We have two different types of hockey. We have hockey with a puck, which they play out in Kirov-Chepetsk. Then in Kirov, they have hockey with a ball, which I guess is sometimes called bandy, and that's played in Rodina. So we'd go to different games there. I went to at least one hockey match with him. He would go to the local football matches. He was a big supporter of Dynamo Kirov. And that's really how he got into this book. Dynamo Kirov, for most of the time Larry visited Kirov, was not a particularly good team. But Larry was a staunch supporter, and he'd heard about this time in the 1980s when the team had been like superstars, and he wanted to know how you go from being really good for a couple of seasons to not so good. And he started looking through the archives to figure out what kinds of information he could find. Unfortunately, I ended up on this project because Larry passed away. He passed away while the book had passed peer review, but not yet finished the publication process. He was a good friend. He was a member of my dissertation committee, and it was important for his family. I found a lot of interesting things about Larry's family. I met two of his ex-wives. His current wife and his girlfriend. And it was important for the unique extended family that this project be finished for him. I agreed to do that.
Sounds like he's quite an interesting person and a great friend.
Oh, Larry was very interesting.
Further to that, sports, the early Soviet Union. What made sport so controversial in, say, for example, that first decade after the revolution?
So sport, particularly competitive sport, was viewed as bourgeois and foreign by many of the early Soviet leaders. For example, in 1920, the Soviet Republic created a Supreme Council of Physical Culture and explicitly omitted the word sport in its title. Radical voices condemned almost all forms of contest. For example, the Proletarian Culture and Educational Organizations, which is Prolekult, which was founded in 1917, was one such voice. It insisted on the replacement of so-called bourgeois culture with a proletarian one, and dismissed competition as bourgeois and foreign. So any kind of sporting activity should avoid specialization by its participants, not keep or set records, and involve the public at large. Prolekult would allow sports primarily in forms of pageants to celebrate revolutionary holidays and the performance of so-called labor gymnastics to enhance productivity on the shop floor. So the idea was that you were doing sports not to compete against each other, but to improve yourself physically so that you could be a better soldier and a better worker for the state. But not everyone loved this idea. Lenin and other prominent Bolsheviks rejected the notion of creating a distinct proletarian culture because they had a lot of other things they had to deal with running the country. So they preferred instead to sort of co-opt the bourgeois legacy and take the parts they thought useful. And organized sports and athletic contests were seen as useful in a new revolutionary form. The Soviet state initially did not participate in the Olympics. They instead created the Red Sports International, also known as the Sportintern.
Did you happen to know if they were even invited to the Olympics?
I don't know if they were even invited, honestly, but they didn't want to participate anyway. They created their own communist alternative in 1921, and it was an auxiliary of the Communist International. So at these venues, people participated in a number of different, I'm not even sure that we would call them sports, physical activity, such as gymnastics, tumbling, calisthenics, grenade throwing, and hiking.
They should bring that one back for sure.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of weird sports. I mean, curling is a sport, throwing the hammer is a sport. Why not a grenade? This allowed people of different abilities to participate. They had the first Sportintern competition in August 1929, when Moscow was not invited or refused to compete in the Summer Olympics in Amsterdam. So it was held at the same time as an alternative. More than 7,000 athletes, including several hundred foreigners, showed up and participated in the 12 events. Football was one of them. Individual records were written down, but these games were seen as collectivist activities rather than elitist. So the goal was to have a group of people doing one activity together rather than focusing on, as you know, even now in team sports, you have star players and stuff, and that becomes more the focus. And they were always sort of uncomfortable in the 1920s with the focus on individual stars. In 1925, the Communist Party Central Committee is uneasy with competition in the setting of records. It advanced what it called physical culture as a means to promote public health and the cultural, economic, and military training of youth. It did note that competition could be important, but only as a means of involving the public in physical culture and promoting the achievement of entire collectives. This does eventually change in the 1930s. In the 1930s, starting with about 1931, you have the introduction of a program which is now called GTO. It stands for Gotova Trudaya Baroni, ready for labor and defense of the USSR. And this encourages physical exercise among adolescents and adults by awarding them badges for achievement in various activities, sort of like Boy Scout badges. You get them for shooting and different activities like that. And this persists. It even exists in Russia today. They brought the program back. You can earn badges for various physical feats. And basically, you have state-sponsored sports at this point. Oh, you also start developing the title of Master of Sport. This does not exist in the West that I am aware of. You actually can receive a diploma and sort of like an academic title of Master of Sport if you complete specific steps. The closest we might have would be something like doing the various tests to get your different belts in karate.
Okay, yeah.
So you have to complete specific steps and demonstrate specific levels of knowledge in order to get this Master of Sport title.
Would those people be considered like stars? Were they essentially separating themselves out in terms of skill level or just in completing the tasks required?
Oh, they're definitely more skilled, but they're not stars in the way we would think of now in the modern Western world, because this did not involve giant salaries.
Billions of dollars, yeah.
No shoe endorsements here. But the title of Master Sport is created in May of 1934, and they start now, having individual records and recognizing the idea of sport as being useful and something that can be lauded as a personal achievement, if that makes sense. And this coincides with the development in other spheres of the economy of personal achievements among workers, too. This is coinciding with the Stakhanovite and shock worker movements. So you go away from having sort of collectivist actions to celebrating extraordinary achievements of individuals. And the state becomes far more comfortable with that in the 30s.
So I have a question for you, because I know that, of course, your specialty, as seen through your book, was the Stalin Constitution, written in 1936. Do you happen to know Stalin's perspectives on all of this, whether it's the transition to this more individual achievement for sports, or like really anything that he had to say about sports?
I don't get the impression that he wrote much about sports. Most of the stuff comes from people like Lunacharsky, who was the first head of, Narkompros? Or was it Narkom? Well, the educational ministry. I can't remember. There was the Ministry of Enlightenment. I can't remember which acronym that is off the top of my head. But Lunacharsky was not necessarily a big fan of sport. He is the Commissar of Education from 1917 to 1929. And he writes a whole book called My Thought About Sport. And he really is dismissive of the competitive spectator sports that you see in the West. He says they're a form of entertainment that diverts the working class's focus away from the creation of a just and equitable society. And he prefers the focus on physical culture, basically bettering yourself physically, on non-competitive exercise, personal hygiene, nutrition, healthy conditions at work. Although he also really liked boxing, which is very much an individual sport. So, there are contradictions throughout this entire dialogue between sport and physical culture.
Key concept that developed soon after the revolution, or I guess even during the revolution, was this concept of the new Soviet person, man or woman. How did physical exercise as a focus figure into this concept of the new Soviet person? And what was the new Soviet person in the first place? What does that even mean?
Well, that's sort of a complicated question in and of itself. A lot of historians talk about the idea of Homo Sovieticus, which I don't really like, which is the idea that you're basically creating a new species of person. And that's not exactly what the Bolsheviks had in mind. The idea was to develop someone who was modern, cultured, physically fit, healthy, and could be a productive member of society. And the idea behind the new Soviet person was to create these well-rounded citizens that could help create new Soviet society. And they go about this in many ways. You have, this is focus on kulturnist, which is about cleanliness and personal hygiene. So, thinking about things like keeping your house clean, making sure you have curtains and houseplants, doing checks for cockroaches, making sure you bathe regularly. And physical activity is, of course, part of this. Part of it is, of course, training people for the military. In 1917, the RFSFR, even before it's the Soviet Union, places all sports clubs and societies under Moscow's Military Training Administration, because they need healthy soldiers. And that's the idea, too, behind GTO, is training people to be physically fit to be soldiers. And also, physical culture was seen as a good way of spending your leisure time. It was healthier and more constructive than drinking or gambling or smoking or having sex, which were popular things to do when you don't have TV or internet.
I think throughout the Soviet Union's history, all those things were quite popular activities.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably even popular now, but they're not seen as constructive or healthy ways to spend your time, for society. Drinking and gambling and smoking all have serious social implications that are bad.
So actually, let's go back here for a second. So we talked about Homo Sovieticus.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that misunderstanding? Like, how is it twisted for this new kind of species thing?
It tends to be tied with ideas of Soviet exceptionalism in historiography. And that is where you treat the Soviet Union as if it's something that is not like anything else and completely divorced from the world that surrounds it and its past. And I think that's really the wrong way to approach things. The Soviet Union had much in common with both its past. A lot of the social structures, the people, even people in positions of power existed in the Tsarist times. And you bring a lot of the low-ranking cadres and stuff with you because they're the ones that have education and know how things work. The Soviet Union, is in a dialogue with the rest of the world. You see this one with the discussion of the Constitution. The Constitutional Committee pulled constitutions from other countries. They read books by philosophers, French philosophers, American philosophers, about what it means to be a constitution and what consent to be governed and all of this stuff was. So there's a constant dialogue with the outside world that when you talk about Homo Sovieticus and Soviet exceptionalism just gets ignored. And it tends to be part of this Cold War narrative to paint the Soviet Union as not only exceptional, but bad.
Totalitarian.
Yeah, I hate totalitarianism. That's just a giant pile of bullshit. You're like, these are people on bicycles with no phones. How are they monitoring everything?
Yeah, there's nothing more terrifying than a communist on a bicycle.
I mean, in Kirov, that means for 6 months out of the year, they can't even see you because we get 10 feet of snow.
Yeah, no, that would be an impediment to a bike for sure.
Yeah.
So it seems like in the 30s, attitudes changed towards sports. Why was this? What was the specific rationale for this change?
There seems to be a larger cultural and political shift going from the valorization of the masses in the 1920s to a glorification of hierarchy and the individual hero in the 1930s. Little men and women, by little we mean everyday average people, could suddenly become big through miraculous achievements on the job. For example, Stakhanovites. Some of these people, there's good examples from Kirov. One woman who worked, I think it was Leninskaya Iskra farm, she is a milkmaid. But she's a Stakhanovite milkmaid, and she's elected to the Supreme Soviet as a representative of her community. I mean, how many milkmaids are elected to Congress? I don't think any.
Yeah, I'm guessing zero, but I could be wrong, I guess. I don't know.
Or Parliament in Canada. I don't think you have many Canadian milkmaids in government.
Nope, not at all.
Also, you have at the same time a whole bunch of different expeditions. There's an expedition to the North Pole. There is a flight from the Soviet Union to the west coast of the United States. And these people are also, they're heralded as, great pioneers, heroes, individual achievers, explorers. And so you also see this picking up in athletics with the portrayal of individual athletes as heroes. And you also start seeing the Soviet Union's engaging in international competition in football, not just in their own sport and turn alternative events, but you have in October 1934, Soviet football teams playing abroad, playing against the Czechs, playing against the French team racing. They don't necessarily do so well, but they are reaching out into the world and they're starting to understand that engaging in an international sphere is also prestigious for the Soviet Union. So promoting individual achievements and good professional sports becomes an important part of the culture in the 30s.
So for listeners that may be wondering why earlier I asked whether the Soviet Union would even have been invited to the Olympics in the early 20s, early mid-20s, or throughout the 20s, really, was because, soon after the establishment of the Soviet Union, virtually most countries, especially particularly in the West, cut off all diplomatic relations with Russia, which is now had become the Soviet Union. And I believe the US only really restarted that back in 1933. So it seems like the 1930s was really an opportunity for the Soviet Union to move from being this pariah state that was left alone, or even rather not left alone, but rather attacked by other countries, to being part of the international community.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact year U.S.-Soviet relationships take off. I mean, they do have scientific exchanges in the 1920s. There is a seed exchange, actually, interestingly enough, in the mid-1920s through the early 1930s, where there's a seed bank in New York and Soviet scientists visit. It's sort of a precursor to the sort of exchange that happens under Khrushchev in the 1950s and 1960s. So it may depend what kind of sphere we're talking about, too, what kind of relationship they have.
Oh, certainly. The focus of Larry's book is football, which is in North America is known as soccer.
Oh, you call it soccer in Canada, too?
Yeah.
I thought that was just a weird American thing.
No, it's a North American thing. Womp womp. Yeah, we call it soccer. I don't know why, but it's funny because we're a former British colony, right? But they still call it soccer. It's weird.
We corrupted you.
Exactly. So when people were playing soccer in the Soviet Union, initially in the 1920s and early 1930s, were they playing in clubs? Were they playing as part of their trade unions? How were these sports organized? Who was a team sponsored by?
Well, the answer to your question is yes. But there were several different organizations that were involved here. It was not uncommon for factories to have their own football teams. It was not uncommon for different branches of Soviet society. For example, Dynamo. The Dynamo Society is attached to the state security organs. The Dynamo Society was created by Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix of the Chekhov, Felix Dzerzhinsky. And the Dynamo Society is supported, at least in part monetarily, from the state security organs. And they have their own Soviet, and there are different levels of Dynamo and different Dynamo teams. It's like a franchise. There's Dynamo Kirov, there's Dynamo Kiev, there's Dynamo Tbilisi, there's Dynamo Moscow. The military has their own teams too, the Red Army teams. You have a bunch of teams associated with other types of industry. So it really depends. And where the money comes from is one of the things that Larry really looked at. A lot of times it came from someplace it wasn't supposed to. But I think that might be part of modern sports in general.
That's true. I mean, look at FIFA, right?
Or I don't know in Canada if that happened, but in the US there was a huge scandal in college sports where they were, wooing players with like diamond earrings and hookers and bright, shiny cars and stuff.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Even though the Soviet state didn't like professional sports, professional football in particular was very popular. People enjoy, not me, but other people enjoy watching football. Do you like football?
So this is a funny thing. So like throughout my life, I've been active in sports, but I've never enjoyed watching them, it's weird. You know, I'll watch it if there's like a big game. Like most recently, there was the NHL, the Stanley Cup Finals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was the Florida Panthers versus the Edmonton Oilers. There's a decent amount of Canadian teams in the NHL, but it's been like maybe 30 years since a Canadian team had won the Stanley Cup. And so the whole country was rooting for them, essentially, right? I watched game 7. Like, I skipped the first 6 games. I was like, okay, I'll watch the last one. And they ended up losing, so that sucked. So no, I don't normally watch sports, but I enjoy engaging in physical activity.
I mean, it's weird as an American because soccer is not very popular in the U.S. We tend to think of it as a girls' sport, which is sort of the opposite in the rest of the world. But I know, people can be absolutely fanatical about their football teams.
Yeah.
And that was true in the Soviet Union. People get really attached to these teams for various reasons. And in the early 1920s, clubs start trying to build good teams. People like you better if you win.
True.
I mean, there are some teams that still have fans, even if they suck terribly. Pittsburgh Pirates, anybody? I guess in Canada, the joke is the Toronto Maple Leafs suck.
The Maple Leafs, yeah, no, they definitely suck. And like the Oilers, it's changed recently, but yeah, they had a streak of just not being great. So yeah, the Leafs is our equivalent to that for sure.
But people like it when you win. And so in the early 1920s, clubs are trying to get players to come. They offer them fictional jobs, bonuses, benefits like apartments or rooms in a hotel rather than in a dormitory. And there are players transferring from one team to the other within this market. And of course, the Soviet government is not enjoying the fact that you're having this market for sports players developing with all of these perks that may or may not be legal. Like a fictional job is not legal.
I wasn't sure if I heard you. You said fictional as in like
fictional.
A fake.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So they sign them up, say they work at the factory, and they've never been in the building.
Oh, that's hilarious. Okay.
And you also, as it becomes more popular, the Soviet Union starts to create governing organs of football. You have the development at the municipal level, regional and national levels. And you also have more professionalization and longer training periods, greater benefits for the players. In 1935, a leading sports newspaper, Krasny Sport, openly discusses the sale and transfer of players, in which athletes as well as clubs reap considerable financial reward. This is sort of the market you see now in sports. And at the end of 1935, the Komsomol Central Committee and the Committee for Physical Culture condemned this practice. Paying people lots of money to transfer is not really very socialist. But it continued anyway. And it's further enhanced with the formation of Major League Football in 1936, modeled after leagues similar to like the British leagues. Consisting of 7 teams, it quickly expanded to over 20. And then you have minor leagues that are formed basically as farm teams for the major league teams. So with this professionalization, you start getting football that you might recognize from like Britain or Italy, or I don't know what American football looks like. Okay, I know what American football looks like. I have no idea what American soccer looks like. I don't know how any of that works because...
Well, I know that you guys have... Well, the only thing I know about American soccer is that David Beckham played there for a bit and Messi is now playing there. That's all I know.
Really? Someone must have some money.
Yeah, no, seriously. Messi must take up like 75% of the team's budget for sure. So in terms of what's happening in the Soviet Union at the time, this is the 30s, what other events that you can think of, parallel events, are allowing for this professionalization to become a thing? And even for these clubs to start maybe illicitly building these structures?
Oh, well, that just has always happened. So, going back to the idea of totalitarianism is a giant steaming pile of garbage. Nobody is in control of anything. And you have, in so many cases, people at the local or regional level bending, breaking, ignoring rules to get things done because otherwise nothing works. This is the same way that they get building supplies. They don't get enough allocated through the state budget, so they, do a backroom deal with some homies. And this is the same kind of gray economy that you see developing here with the football players. It's the exact same mechanisms put into place because the state is struggling to keep up with these developments and they're reacting rather to the situation as it exists rather than trying to actually control it. They're not very successful at controlling it at all because this shit goes on through the 1980s.
Yeah, I mean, it's come up a lot on this show, this question of totalitarianism. Almost virtually every guest has confirmed that. Yeah. In like a variety of spheres, like you said, like, I mean, we'll talk about like healthcare. We'll talk about like, as you mentioned, like the agriculture, building, sports.
Nobody is in control of nothing.
Yeah. So interesting. So interesting because it's just so different than what the popular image.
Yeah, the popular image is like Stalin says something and everybody does that. Yeah. They, in fact, do not. In fact, they often do the exact opposite and just hope they don't get caught.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're surrounded by, like, 10 feet snow for 6 months of the year, I mean...
Yeah, have fun coming and telling me what to do, right?
Yeah. Huh. And then, so, internationally... So what's going on? Say, for example, like we have these professional organizations now developing the Soviet Union. Do they reach out to the world?
Well, the problem is the war. So really in the 30s, you have some different show games between various sort of friendly communist powers. Like you have Bosques from Republican Spain come and play in Moscow. And you have the sport and turn events, but the USSR doesn't really start interacting on a global stage with non-communist people until after the war. I mean, I think during the war, it's pretty obvious why we're not playing international sports. But very soon after the war, Soviet football enters the international arena. In November 1949, Dynamo Moscow goes and plays 4 matches in Great Britain. They play Arsenal, Cardiff City, Chelsea, and the Glasgow Rangers, and they actually win. Which is shocking to many, many people, including novelist George Orwell, who has some opinions on this.
Interesting. Orwell has a lot of opinions on the Soviet Union.
He has a lot of opinions on a lot of things. But he shares his dismay in the socialist newspaper, The Tribune. Now that the brief visit of the Dynamo football team has come to an end, it is possible to say publicly what many thinking people were saying privately before the Dynamos ever arrived. That is, that sport is an unfailing cause of ill will. The result of the Dynamo's tour, insofar as it is any result, will create fresh animosity on both sides. At the international level, sport is frankly mimic warfare. It is war minus shooting. So he was not happy that they lost, and he has no love for the Soviet Union. Not that that shouldn't be obvious.
I'd never heard of this take from him before, so I'm going to add it on to the list of Orwell's bad takes for sure.
It's got to be a long list.
Yeah.
And this is partially true. I mean, during the Cold War, international sports does become another arena of political competition. But also, the Soviet Union is really happy that they won. 36 million Soviet listeners listen to broadcasts of the games in Great Britain. And Soviet newspapers write all sorts of glowing remarks about this. And they really do think that they are going to be globally superior. That doesn't actually happen, but this launches them into the international stage. In 1947, they play matches with Sweden and Norway. The Red Army team plays against Czechoslovakia and loses. But in the decade that follows, in the 50s, they start competing in international tournaments. They compete in the Olympics. In 1952, the national football team competes in Helsinki, which is the first Olympics the USSR competed in. And Soviet officials are very invested in winning at this time because, the Olympics are very, very political. This is about showcasing your country. In the case of the Soviet Union, showcasing socialism as a system, trying to prove that if you're superior in sports, you're probably superior in other spheres as well. I'm sure you're aware that the Olympics, during the Cold War was basically an international pissing contest, particularly in the 1960s When is the Olympics in Los Angeles? 1978? And then in 1980, the Moscow Olympics, where the U.S. isn't invited. But they hoped that their entry would win gold. They do not. They're knocked out in the preliminary round, and they tie Yugoslavia of all countries. And I'm sure you're aware at this time the relationship between Stalin and Tito is not good. So in many ways, you start seeing sports at the international level become a reflection of politics. They play in the 1958 World Cup, and they reach the quarterfinals but lose in June to Sweden, but become very fixated on victory in international competition. And this stands in sharp contradiction to the earlier focus on mass participation and physical fitness. Now you must win. And this is where the title of this book comes in, Win or Else. Teams that don't win tend to suffer negative consequences. Teams that are winning can do things that may not necessarily be super legal. But as long as you're producing results, no one cares. When you stop winning, people start looking at your books and your team roster and how you're getting these players and how you're getting this money, et cetera, and that becomes very problematic.
The Soviet Union was playing as one team internationally, not like the Soviet Republic of blah, 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 or did they have those internationally? Okay, just the Soviet Union as a whole.
The Soviet Union as a whole, although specific teams from the major leagues were also sent to play in international demonstration matches.
Out of curiosity, if you know or not, was the team reflective of the diversity of the Soviet Union, or were they like mostly Russian players?
It depends on the year, but there are a lot of players from different republics. There's a whole section in the book about the level of corruption on sports, and I sort of think that is sort of the main focus. And it goes again back to the idea of totalitarianism. If totalitarian existed, this level of corruption should not be possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The fact that it's rampant tells you that the government's not very good at controlling things. And many people think, for example, that the repressions in the 30s is sort of the last-ditch attempt to start crushing things that aren't working well. Mm-hmm. Things are not going well when it comes to control if you have to start shooting people.
True. So what were the repercussions that, as you mentioned, people looking into the books and stuff like that? Then what? Like, then were people sent to jail or worse? Like,
I don't think anybody was actually shot, but in some cases, yes, definitely jail. So looking at repercussions, so you have, like I said, people doing a bunch of illegal things to entice good players, including things like creating fictitious jobs or fictitious military ranks if you're drafted into one of the military teams. Both the state security organs and the military itself use military ranks. Offering things like apartments, cars, country houses, scarce goods as a reason to join their team. And sometimes there were some straight-up strong-arm tactics. Beria was apparently a big fan of Dynamo Moscow, and he threatened several players with arrest of them or their families if they did not join Dynamo Moscow from competing teams like Spartak. And the Red Army teams would simply just draft the players they wanted into the army, so they had to come play for them. You're like, this is interesting. It was not uncommon to threaten players. There were definitely, when they caught players cheating, there were definitely issues. Several players were suspended from being able to play soccer. This is more in the Khrushchev period. So in the Khrushchev period, people are suspended. In one case, an entire team is liquidated for a season due to their cooking the books and getting funding from sources that they're not supposed to have.
This is so interesting, and I wish I knew more about this, but I don't. But what I do know, right, is that, because, we're talking about this, it might sound like, oh, this is very specific to the Soviet Union, corruption in sports.
It's not, though.
But yeah, it's not even remotely, right? You're talking about threatening players like that. I know that happens in other places around the world where it's if a player doesn't perform the way that they're supposed to in a high stakes game, the pitchforks are going to come out for them.
Well, it's not just threats either. Because this is the other weird part. Because Dynamo is governed by the state security organs, this also means they have access to the camps, the prison camps. And they go to the prison camps and they pull out star football players and make them coaches of different teams. At one point, the coach of Moscow Dynamo is pulled from the Gulag, and the first coach of Kirov Dynamo, Alexander Alexandrovich Keller, is pulled out of Vyatlog and made the head coach of Kirov because they really want to win, and he doesn't really have the opportunity to say no.
So, okay, maybe this is the unique aspect of the Soviet experience in terms of soccer, or football, rather. Then, were there teams in gulags?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
There isn't. I mean, this is beyond the scope of the book, but there are definitely teams in gulags. There is a really good article that's called Gulag Soccer. I cannot remember who writes it. Stephen, I cannot remember his last name. But it's part of, within the gulag, the idea of, again, developing a cultured person that can actually successfully reintegrate into society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, gulags had theater circles. They had their own publishing houses. They printed books and newspapers. They had literacy circles where people could learn to read and write. There was a real focus on developing culture, and it was specifically within the Gulag system referred to as perikovka, reforging a person. So you would engage them in these positive aspects of society so they could hopefully reintegrate and be good Soviet citizens when they're released. And there are also soccer matches within the prisoner of war camps with the Nazis, but it's as sadistic as you would suspect it is. And again, beyond the scope of this book.
So, sorry, what did you mean by that? That there was Nazis in prisoner of war camps in the Soviet Union, or vice versa?
The Nazis had Soviet prisoners that they forced to play on soccer teams for their amusement, and they would sometimes shoot the losers.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, well, they're Nazis. I mean,
yeah, I guess what could you expect from them? But yeah, no, it's very interesting. I know it's outside the scope of the book, but about the Gulag. Haven't talked much about it on this show yet, but it's certainly a different perspective than widely seen.
So why don't we talk a little bit about the second half of the book, which is all on Dynamo Kirov and sort of the formation of the team. As I said before, the Dynamo sports organization is associated with the Ministry of State Security. It goes by many different names, the CHK, GPU, NKVD, and eventually becomes the KGB. And they do go into the camps and they pull Keller out. Keller was a pretty good football player. He played in the 30s for Torpedo in Gorky. He played for Stalingrad's Traktor in 1940, and during the attack of Stalingrad by the Nazis in 1941, he's deported because he's of German descent to Kazakhstan, and then he is shipped to Vyatlog, and they pull him out, and they make him head of the team in 1946. And so that's really the start of Kirov Dynamo. In 1951, Kirov's regional branch of the Ministry of Internal Affairs gets involved in improving the play, releases him, and hires him as the coach. They're like, we know where we've got some good coaches. Let us just go get one. And I think it's interesting that, they see him as a suspect till they realize he's really good at football. And they're like, come work for us.
Yeah, no, forget all that stuff. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, again, this isn't the topic of the episode, but the mass deportations that happened during or before World War II, and how some people end up becoming reintegrated, like this guy was. Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. Because I was going to ask you, what did he do? What was the thing that he did? And I guess he's German. Yeah, that was the problem.
We can see why Germany attacking you Germans might be problematic, and certainly the U.S. throws all the Japanese people into internment camps. Not the Germans because they're white, but I don't know. In Canada, were there any internments of suspect nationalities?
Yeah, so the Japanese were definitely interned during World War II and made to work on farms, quote unquote, during the period of the war. Very similar to what happened in the US, right? After the war, their shit got taken by while they were interned and other people while they were interned. Also during World War I, there were internment camps as well, particularly for Slavic people. They're actually responsible, I think, for building, what is it? Jasper or Banff, which is kind of like a national park in Canada, was essentially built by these interned Slavic people during World War I.
Interesting, because the U.S. doesn't intern Slavic people in World War I, but we're also not involved in World War I very long either.
I guess because we had that British connection, which made us prone to participate.
We come in 1917, say we won, and then we leave again.
There's a pattern of that, for sure.
Kirov Dynamo, chugs along pretty well until about 1979, and then they just have an absolutely disastrous season. And part of it is because they are underfunded. This is constantly an issue. Well, I mean, with pretty much every organization, unless you make rockets, there's never enough money. In addition, their club their stadium needed repairs. After returning from a road trip in 1979, their stadium was so bad they couldn't even play in it. They had to play elsewhere in the city in the Manpower Reserve Stadium, which later explodes. It's somewhere in either the late 70s or the early 80s, someone stored fireworks in the clubhouse.
Oh, shit.
And they blew up and a bunch of people were killed. One of my colleagues at work was in the explosion. She has burns on her legs.
Oh, wow.
From it. Yeah, it was bad. So don't store fireworks someplace where they can catch fire, where lots of people hang out. So they needed a lot of help, and they get help from the Ministry of State Security. Specifically, the head of the Kirov regional branch. There is a new head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. His name is Alexander Yakovlevich Mazarenko, and he comes to Kirov in 1978 after working in Voronezh, and he loves football. It's said of him that he loved football up to the point of fanaticism. So he begins to start pushing to get funding and good players for the team. At the end of 1979, they agree to hire a new coach, Valery Ovechkinov, and a general manager. And they start also trying to hire new players. The farm teams aren't very good, so what they start doing is holding tryouts and offering incentives for established older players to come from other teams to come play for Kirov. And this works pretty well. Dynamo's key to success was that its sponsors were raising substantial funds, much of them off the books. From the National Dynamo organization in Moscow, getting money from Kirov's municipal and regional governments, and from the major defense plants, because the Dynamo Society is connected to the state security agents, which are connected to the Ministry of Defense, so they can move money between each other. And also, the Dynamo Society has a sports equipment manufacturer in the Kirov region that they use the monies from to reinvest into their sports team.
So I have a question, because I'm finding this amusing that the state security apparatus has this investment in sports in a way, in soccer, that's like quite unique. Like, why?
Initially under Dzerzhinsky, the Dynamo Sports Society is really, again, about cultivating physical fitness among your state security agents. We know that fat cops can't chase you real well. The same is true of fat state security agents. You want these people to be mentally and physically fit, and sport's an important way to do that. And the society grows. It starts expanding. They have youth leagues, they have wrestling, they have football. They have all sorts of things connected to the Dynamo Sports Society. They do their own parades. And so it grows into this larger sort of mass movement, but it's always connected to and sponsored by the state security organs. It is really weird. I mean, it would be like,
CIA.
The CIA having its own football team. I mean, it is weird. I will totally give you that. But also because he's from the Ministry of State Security or the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Mazarenko can put pressure on people to get money for his football team. And he absolutely does this. With enhanced financial support, the club recruits good coaches, as I said, Ovechkinov, and athletes. And they play remarkably well in 1980 and 1981, to the point that they are promoted to the prestigious First League of Soviet football. But there are some problems. One, they don't ever develop good farm teams. They are relying on established older athletes. And in sports, by the time you're hitting like 28, 29, 30, you're getting old for sports. And so these men don't necessarily have a long shelf life, and they are not very good at cultivating people in the youth leagues that can step up and be the next generation of players. So they're buying people that are already successful, but maybe a little over the hill, and this does not lead to long-term success. The other problem is that they constantly need more money. Dynamo's need for enhanced funding comes at a time when Moscow's organs for the administration of sports are trying to limit the payment of improper benefits to players and coaches. And they go after several teams, particularly Kuibashev's Krylia Sovietov. Kuibashev is now Samara. And Vladimir's Torpedo. I do believe it is Torpedo that is actually disbanded for a season because they were caught using illegal funds. And Kirov's Dynamo comes under suspicion. They do manage to wiggle free of any punishment for its illegal behavior, largely because they're winning. Krylia Sovietov and Torpedo start losing, and that becomes unacceptable. If you are cheating and losing, then people start getting fined, kicked out of sports, banned.
I have a question. If the state security apparatus, which is, funding a lot of this, how do they face repercussions? Like, is it like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, who's stepping in being like, you're doing a wrong thing? Or is it because they're losing and they're like, hey, you're losing, buddy, so this is the repercussion? It's
the sports administration of the Soviet Union that starts stepping in and looking at books, which is separate from the state security organs. And also, it is worth noting that Kirov's municipal and regional governments help Dynamo raid other football clubs of their best athletes, but try to protect their own. So there's this competition between what is essentially poaching athletes. I think this happens in modern sports where, they break contracts for millions of dollars. And Kirov is taking the better sports players from different teams, but they do not want someone to be able to come in and make offers on their people. So they bend rules to protect Kirov's interests, and they attempt to keep Kirov in the first league. It doesn't necessarily work very well. Fans are really excited about this, but the season just kind of unravels. They don't have the momentum. The players aren't quite good enough. They're a little too old to keep doing well in the first league. So after a year or two in the first league, unfortunately, Kirov Dynamo is relegated back to the second league, and the Dynamo organization is forced to admit that they have engaged in financial irregularities. Ovechkinov is fired as head coach as a result, and further losses make the team even more vulnerable to being called out for this bad behavior. Eventually, Mazarenko is basically told you need to stop doing this now. And basically, you start seeing the team unravel as they no longer get the funding or support that they had because they were no longer winning. So, I think this is really interesting. I mean, I don't like soccer. I don't like football. I finished this book because Larry was an important person to me. This would never have been a topic I would have chosen. But I think the machinations behind it are really quite fascinating. So the win or else mentality in the USSR and abroad promotes illicit behavior and hypocrisy. I mean, we can see that with the FIFA scandal. I mean, this is not something purely Soviet. Within the highly authoritarian Soviet Union, it appeared as a little habitat of freedom of expression. People could talk about different things in the context of sports. Whether their national team or local club won or lost, administrators, players, fans, and reporters expressed their heartfelt pleasure or displeasure with their team's performance. They could even suggest modest reforms of football and the governing agents connected to football to improve overall play of their favorite. The presence of financial tricks and scapegoating, so evident in Soviet football, were present in all other spheres of Soviet life and may be understood as a key feature of both the Soviet system and organized sports in general. Many countries outside of the USSR also engage in financial shenanigans or other unethical practices to win at all costs. And I think that's important to situate the Soviet experience within the greater sphere of sports as a whole.
Final question here. What is the afterlife of the Soviet soccer system in the post-Soviet world?
Well, it depends on what team and how well you're winning. The winning teams are doing pretty good. I mean, Moscow Dynamo still exists. You have teams like Zenit and Spartak that are big corporations. They are exactly like the kinds of football teams you would see from Arsenal or Milan, or, they sell merchandise. They have huge stadiums that are named by companies that give them money. I think Zenit is sponsored by Gazprom. Exactly what you expect. The smaller teams have taken a big hit because there's no funding. The government no longer funds them the way they funded them in the Soviet Union, and even that was, of course, not enough. Unfortunately, Dynamo Kirov has not done particularly well. In 2008, they started finishing at the bottom of the league and occupied dead last place at the end of the 2015 to 16 and 2016 to 17 seasons. And the club was closed in 2017, although there are plans to reopen it for this upcoming season. I don't know if that will happen or not. But a lot of these smaller clubs just simply cannot make bank. And I think that's true with a lot of minor league teams in the US, Canada, the Western world in general, too. They just simply struggle to exist without things like corporate sponsors.
Awesome. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrapped up this part of it?
Not really. I mean, I hope it makes sense. This is sort of hard for me to talk about because I didn't do the research. Larry would have talked your ear off. He loved all of this stuff. He knew all these names. He actually went and met some of these
that's cool.
Football players from the 80s who were still alive.
And so with that said, the title of this book, just to remind everyone listening, it's Win or Else, Soviet Football in Moscow and Beyond, 1921 to 1985, written by late Larry Holmes. It's an excellent book. We did kind of give an overview of the topics, but the book goes into a lot more detail, of course, of what we talked about. Samantha, you did an excellent job explaining to us this research, even though you didn't do it yourself. It's definitely a credit to you for editing this book and ensuring that, it got out there, in honor of Larry.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining the show today. Sabina Mammadova.